We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker, your host for Mostly Economics. Today we have with us Kim Weeden, who's a professor of sociology at Cornell University and also the director for the Study of Inequality. So thanks for joining us, Kim.
Thank you.
So Kim's done a lot of work on inequality and rents and market failures. And to my view, this is very important. I've hit on this in other segments that we've done. But Kim, I think, takes in somewhat different directions. So I thought it'd be very useful to have her on and talk about different ways in which rents lead to inequality. So to start out, maybe I could just ask what if you could define rent. Just tell we all know about rent we pay on our on our house, on a store, or whatever. But rents as they would be used in an economic sense.
Sure. Well, of course, they're related. The rents that we pay for our apartment every month are a type of economic rent. They're basically what we're paying for our landlord, and they are based on the idea that the landlord owns the property and they have rights because they own the property, and we essentially have to pay them for the use of that property. And presumably the landlord is doing it to make a profit. And the idea of rents in the economic sense is basically it's the payments above and beyond the anticipated wages or return on contract that you expect to see if there were no such thing as barriers to entry into actually accessing something. So that's a really highfalutin way of saying it's essentially the premium that you get because you have something to which access is restricted. And the way that I often think about this and thinking about labor market inequality is that there are lots and lots of ways in our labor market that there are institutions that protect certain types of workers and generate rents for them, generate wages above and beyond what you might expect to see in a perfectly free and open labor market. But we don't tend to think about them as barriers. We tend to think about them as something that's sort of natural and inevitable. And I'm going to give you an example of a lot of my work has looked at occupational licenses. And the idea here is that a lot of the occupations with which we're all familiar are licensed. You have to have a license in order to be able to legally practice that occupation. There are lots and lots of licenses that people kind of know about. So we know about lawyers being licensed and we know about doctors being licensed. And you probably know that your hairstylist has to have a license. But it turns out that there's about half of the occupations that you might see in a list of, say, 500 coming out of the Census Bureau. Those all have licenses. And the idea here is that this license, it's basically giving you a patent on a practice, on a set of skills that you have. And you can charge more by virtue of the fact that in order to be a doctor, you have to have a license. It is essentially it's restricting the supply of doctors, of people who can legally say that they are physicians or they are surgeons. And it's generating higher wages by virtue of that restriction on the supply. So rents take a lot of different forms. I like to think about the easiest example for me is to think about the occupation case. Start to talk about our apartments, it becomes a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, the occupation case is striking. I'd like to pick on doctors. You can decide whether you like your doctor or don't. That's beside the point here. But doctors are, just about the highest paid occupation, and our doctors get paid much more than they do in other wealthy countries. And, again, the story is you literally would get arrested if you practice medicine without a license. And there is an important distinction, which many people have driven home to me, that it does, we could argue whether you should have that legal barrier, but you could have the government certify someone as qualified, but not make that a legal requirement. Now, again, you could argue either way, but oftentimes you have certification saying that someone has attained a certain level of skill in an area. And that's distinct from having a license saying if the government doesn't approve of you, you literally can't do it. You get arrested. And obviously the rents are higher in the latter case because, you have the government ensuring that you don't have competition. Anyhow.
Licensing, I think, a long history of licensing in the United States. And really this fascinating tension between licenses as something that protects the public from incompetent or malfeasant practitioners. Like, I don't want to go to an unlicensed dentist, particularly. What's that? Somebody out in the back of the horse barn with some pliers? That's an unlicensed dentist, if you think about it that way. But so there's this tension between protecting the public, particularly in those occupations where the public doesn't really have the skills to be able to evaluate something. Like, yeah, the bedside manner of your doctor matters, but what matters more is that person, when they open you up to do surgery on you, knows what they're doing, right? And I, as a patient, just don't have that skill to be able to evaluate that. So there's this tension between this protecting the public, but it's also protecting the occupation, and it's protecting it by virtue of creating these real barriers to access, limiting the supply of people who are eligible to practice. And doctors and other sorts of healthcare professionals, I think we can often tell ourselves a story about the need to protect the public. But there's been lots of cases of occupations that have really tried to get themselves licensed, basically try to get the state to protect their labor market, where that case for the public interest is a lot more sketchy. One of my favorite examples of this is, I think, the interior designers in Florida were trying to get licensed at one point. Their effort to get licensed failed, and I think because they couldn't convince legislators that it really was in the public interest not to have orange shag carpeting with green curtains or something. I don't know. But the reason why they were trying to do that is essentially because if they're a licensed occupation, then they can essentially charge more. They can also lay claim to being a profession. So there's sort of a status element too to being licensed.
I also, I was mentioning certification before. I've had arguments with my wife. She actually originally got training in economics, but then had a second career as a dog trainer. And she was arguing for licensing of dog trainers. I was going, well, I can understand certification. And, one of the issues there is who does the certification. So there are actually multiple groups in dog training. Not worth going into a lot of dog. Well, I'm fascinated by it, but most people probably won't be. There are multiple groups that did certification in dog training, which then does raise a question. Well, who are these groups? I want to hire a dog trainer. Do I have to find this group or that group? Now, if you had a government certification board, you may assume, and again, this could be a big jump because government agencies could be corrupt too. But you may assume that, okay, they certify you that you have skills as a dog trainer. And, again, then you'd have the option. You could get someone who'd been certified by, this government body as a good dog trainer, or maybe you want to go for someone else. You heard someone else is good. They're not certified. That's your call. To me, that seemed like a good solution, as opposed to licensing it and saying, if you weren't licensed, you simply couldn't do it. But again, those are distinct things.
Yeah. Well, the certification. So my dissertation, which was 14 centuries ago, I was actually trying to get essentially a comprehensive census of occupational licenses, which is possible because these are laws, right? And you can look up laws. But I was also trying to get a census of occupational certifications, and so I called thousands of occupational associations that said, this was in the early days of the web, but they would say on their webpage that they provided a certification. And one of my I was just going through the list alphabetically, basically, of these associations. And I happened to call back to back two competing organizations that offered certifications to astrologers. And what was so funny about it is that they absolutely trashed the other organization. They said, well, our certification is the real certification. And this, if you get this certification in astrology, then you really know how to read the signs or whatever it was. And it was just the funniest. I mean, these people were taking themselves very seriously. But I think, more seriously, more to the point, one of the issues when you have a situation where occupational associations are providing the certification is that the consumer doesn't really know what that means. It's a little bit like, the sort of an organic sticker on a box of cereal. You don't really know what that actually means and who's creating it. I had a student, Kyle Albert, who's now at Georgetown, who was, for his dissertation, he was actually really interested in essentially this industry that was created of people who were certification consultants, but also selling certification programs to membership organizations. So you could basically buy a package, put it on your website, and charge people $400 to get certified in this thing. So it's sort of this, this nested doll of potential, really, for rent seeking, for creating profits out of this system. And you could argue that if a government agency is in charge of certification, they're still setting standards. Presumably, they're setting standards a little bit, perhaps more rationally than my two astrologers associations were. But they're also kind of cutting out the middleman in a way that I think would protect consumers more, but also presumably make it more possible. It would reduce those barriers. It would reduce the cost to a worker who wants to get a certification if they're not basically, funding this for-profit industry of certification consultants and the wares that they're selling to websites.
Yeah, you could hope, at least. And again, I don't want to say, we give it to the government, everything's good, but there's, at least in principle, some transparency there. That, public oversight, that, if I have the board of astrologers, whoever they are, they don't have any obligations. I mean, they could be. Okay, I don't even know what would be good for an astrologer, I'll confess. But in any case, you could, if it's something we actually did care about, licensing hair cutters, barbers, they could say, here are criteria that, would be down on paper. People could evaluate, are those appropriate? And, in principle, see whether they're actually doing it. So if someone sends in and says, hey, I want to be certified, are they automatically certified, or do they have to show, here I have this background, I worked with the barber for, 6 months or whatever the time period would be, and I went to whatever, so at least there'd be some commitment in principle to transparency. And, that's why I think that makes sense in many cases to have, and again, I wouldn't quarrel with doctors being licensed. I think that probably does make sense, but, in occupations where it's not, say, life and death, that, if you get a bad haircut, it's unfortunate, but I don't think most of us would consider that, kind of this worst disaster. So anyhow.
Yeah. I think even in the world of the healthcare professions, there are ways that we could make the system a little bit more rational, a little bit less burdensome. And some of these efforts are actually happening. So just to kind of delve a little deeper, we haven't talked about the fact that every state licenses occupations in a slightly different way, even the same occupation. And if you practice in one state and it's a licensed occupation, you move states, then you have to get a license in that state too. And the medical professions are one place where there have been some policy efforts to try to coordinate, basically say that, well, if you're licensed to be a doctor in New York State, and you want to practice in New Jersey, you don't actually have to get a New Jersey license too. And that seems to be one way that you can kind of resolve some of these market barriers that happen by virtue of kind of expanding the pool of people who can practice at a particular hospital while still retaining some of that protective function, right? They're still licensed. It's just that the states have agreed that, okay, your licensure requirements are good enough for my state, so I'm going to accept those as kind of a signal that this person can practice in my state too. So, just like how rules about shipping beer across state lines began with this very, very complicated and Byzantine maze, they seem to be rationalizing a little bit, and perhaps that's one way that we could think about solving the problem of licensure and really the barriers that create that ultimately the consumers pay for, or the whoever is paying for the medical care. Might be the government is paying for the medical care. But Dean, I know you've worked a lot on this and thinking about how even fairly simple tweaks to how we license some of those medical professions could save a lot of money in a very, very expensive healthcare system.
Yeah, and I won't go on my diatribe about doctors, but and again, I have nothing against doctors. My best friend in the world's a doctor, but I just think our doctors get paid, particularly specialists, they get paid more than they should, and with fewer restrictions, we could bring that pay down. But I won't go on that diatribe. But let me ask, I promised you we wouldn't talk I'm glad we talked about occupational licensing, and that is a clear case of rents. But I want to give you a chance to talk about rents in other areas, because I know you have been looking at other
Yeah,
areas.
yeah. So my co-author in this, David Grusky, who's a professor of sociology at Stanford, and I have really tried to think more broadly about the entire system of rents that scholars often study kind of individually and think about their effects on wages, but haven't kind of put it together into a coherent theory of sorts about the overarching picture of rents and how it generates rising inequality. And the fundamental argument that we're making is that there are what we call top-end rents, and these are the rents they're protecting the most highly educated workers, the CEOs of major corporations, the people who own capital, they own property of some sort, and those rents we can think about kind of expanding income inequality because they're basically giving more and more income or profits up to the very top earners, so people who are probably going to be at the top of a income distribution anyway. And then there are what we call bottom end rents. And our argument about rising income inequality is that if you look over the last, say, 40 years, 50 years, you've seen kind of this chipping away at bottom end rents. And these would be things like the minimum wage, for example, the real value of the minimum wage in the states that haven't raised the minimum wage, so the federal minimum wage, the real value of that has been stagnant and over the longer term declining. And essentially you can think about the minimum wage as being a source of rent for our lowest educated workers typically. But we all know that unionization has been in decline as a share of the labor force, but also in terms of the power of unions. It ebbs and flows depending on who's in charge of the National Labor Relations Board. But in the greater kind of longer run of history, we can say that union power has declined pretty dramatically, just as the real value of the minimum wage has declined. And the destruction of this bottom end rents has really driven down, or at least kept the lower educated workers' wages from rising quite so much. And people have talked about that story a lot, about the decline of unions and inequality and the decline of minimum wage and inequality. This is kind of the bread and butter of economics and some sociology. But we haven't really kind of thought about the flip side of that, which is these either expansion or at least stability in the opportunities that these very highly educated workers or the already advantaged workers who own companies have, the Elon Musks of the world, to extract more and more and more rent, essentially. And I think, as a sociologist, I'm also really interested in the stories that we tell. Right. So for a long time, there was kind of this real, we need to have a free market. Market competition is good. This is the way forward. We always have to do market competition. This was, associated with the conservative position, but I think a lot of liberals kind of bought into that as well. I don't know what to think in the world of Trump, where he's doing tariffs and he's owning parts of companies. I mean, this is, I'm not going to get into that debate. But the general rhetoric for a long time was that market competition was good, but it was always applied to the bottom of the labor market. Like, people didn't really talk about eliminating occupational licenses, for example, right? We haven't had a national conversation about whether this is still some sort of an institution that is doing more benefit than harm. The focus of this ideology of market competition and free markets is always kind of applied in ways that hurt the lower end workers, the lower skilled workers. This kind of ignores all those rent institutions that benefit the already very well off or the very highly educated workers.
In terms of the high, again, picking on doctors again, after I said I would, there was, I'm trying to think of his first name, Van Dam, Andrew Van Dam, who's a reporter at the Washington Post. He has a data page or something like that. He's a good guy. He does very interesting stuff. Anyhow, he did a thing on doctors' pay about, 2 years ago. And he said, he told me this, that, his inbox was just filled with hate mail, that And it was a careful analysis. I don't know what he thinks of doctors. I don't, he was talking to people who had done studies on doctors' pay, and there's some very solid research showing that I think the average pay, this was a couple of years ago, was like 350, maybe 360,000 a year. And he was very careful. Most of that was specialist. It differs a lot. If you're a neurologist, a cardiologist, it's 400 or 500. If you're a primary care physician, it was 200 something. These aren't exact numbers, but ballpark numbers. Anyhow, it was just striking because, I was familiar with it because I've been following the literature, but that, as I say, he was just factual reporting. There was nothing in there. He wasn't pulling things out of his rear. He wasn't, grabbing someone off the street. Do you not like your doctor? Did you get it? These were careful studies looking at solid data. And anyhow, the response was just incredible. So saying that, yes, we look at union wages, that's a rent, they get too much. We look at the minimum wage, again, not everyone's saying that, but, that's something that is debated. Whereas, doctors pay, he does a careful analysis of it, and people just, flipped out.
Yeah. Yeah. And just thinking more broadly, not to pick on the doctors, but thinking more broadly, the people have, including myself, but also folks like Morris Kleiner, have tried to look at kind of the wage returns to licensure, where most of the licenses are concentrated in the professions, the health professions, but there are actually quite a lot. Like my plumber is licensed, my electrician is licensed. If I have my gas stove hooked up or dismantled, that's a different licensed occupation. So kind of the high skilled crafts and then the professions are where those licenses are really concentrated. It turns out that if you look across all occupations and you try to get, what's the average bonus that occupations get for being licensed? A lot of different estimates put it around 10%, 10 to 15%. I mean, it depends on, how you measure, what other kind of controls you throw into your model. But there does seem to be something to this idea that we are paying too much to folks, too much relative to what it would really take to have those folks get the training that they need and work and provide that service within the labor market, even in the absence of some sort of an occupational license. I think what's really interesting about licensure is that it is one of these. Here we are, we're back on licenses, but it is one of those institutions where you can actually see some sort of a potential for bipartisan conversation. So, the folks at Cato Institute, the libertarians at Cato Institute are really interested in licensure in a way that I think kind of creates some pretty interesting opportunities for at least a national conversation about it. It probably won't hit the highly educated healthcare professions, but there is a real question about whether my hairdresser needs to go have 100 hours of continuing education every 3 years in order to be able to cut my hair. I mean, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. And that, he has to pay for that. And therefore he has to charge me more per haircut in order to cover his costs of sustaining his license and getting that continuing education.
Yeah, you mentioned Cato because I learned to shut up and listen to them. Sometimes I remember I was once debating Bill Niskanen, who was the president and chair of Cato for a number of years. Conservative, a real libertarian, because a lot of libertarians, I think, say they want the government out. But then when you actually talk about something like this, they go, no.
Push comes to shove, yeah.
But he was a real libertarian. And I was debating him about progressive income taxes, and he had done some calculations. I made some point, progressive, I forget where we were with the top tax rate, but let's say it was like 39%, somewhere around there. And I said, we could raise that. It was 90%, if you go back to the 50s under Eisenhower. And he had done some calculations. Well, if you factor in whichever other taxes, I don't know, it's sales tax, whatever he had done, he got to, 98%, 100%. I said, so I shot back and I go, well, no one paid that. And then Bill goes, well, if you have a tax that no one pays, it's probably not a very good tax. And go, yep, you got a point there. And
you got a point there, yeah.
So, sure. So they do, again, I learned to listen at least to someone like Bill Niskanen, and he made a point with occupational licensing. If you have a rule like, I'm mentioning with the hairdresser, that, do you really want to prosecute someone for cutting hair without a license? And, if you have a law that you're embarrassed to enforce, then it's probably not a very good law. So
Yeah.
it's worth thinking about.
Yeah. Non-compete agreements to be able to work at Jimmy John's, making subs, right? That's another example of a law that's probably embarrassing to enforce. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the hairdressers. I think that's also we could think about one of the challenges with licensure is that even though the standards are always written as, you must have X years of education and graduated from an accredited school and demonstrate this and the other thing, they can be exclusionary on other sorts of grounds. And the hairdressers, I think, are a good example because there's a lot of question about whether hair braiders who are not working with scissors or they're not really working with toxic chemicals, they're braiding hair, should be required to basically pay the same fees in order to be licensed or not. And this, of course, takes on a racial dimension because the hair braiders are primarily people of color who are doing this within their own communities. And then just to broaden this out to thinking more generally about rents, I haven't kind of fully developed these ideas. I'm floating them out here, but we can think about really the returns to discrimination as being a source of rent, right? So this is a situation in which one group is intentionally excluding another group. It's driving down their wages and it's increasing the wages of the in-group in many ways. And this goes, way, way back to, Ken Arrow in the economics world, I think. But if we want to think kind of comprehensively about all the ways that rents are extracted in our economy, I think we need to think about discrimination as really being almost one of the most insidious and pervasive ways that rents are generated, even if it's not kind of built into an identifiable thing like an occupational license. So that's another place where we're trying to expand this thinking about what would wage inequality look like and how would wages be distributed if things were more fair or a more like the competitive open labor market of neoclassical economist fantasies. I don't know.
I want to say give one more example on because you prompted me with the issue of discrimination on licensing and discrimination, then get on to some other areas because I did say we were going to talk about these other areas that you've done work on. But a friend of mine wrote this book on the first 100 Black accountants in the United States, and she gave a talk in D.C. She lives in New York, and it doesn't matter. And I dragged my wife to it. And she goes, "This is either going to be incredibly boring or tremendously interesting." And it was the latter, because the first Black accountant in the U.S., certified accountant, was I think in the 20s, maybe, and anyhow, she had a number, she had gone through and tried to find, the first 100, many of them were not still alive, but family members, people could tell her about that. Anyhow, one of the stories is a Black woman who got licensed. She's the first Black to be licensed as an accountant in Maryland. And they had requirement that you had to take the exam in this city on the Eastern Shore that the hotels did not allow Blacks to stay there. So she arranged, she found a Black family through her church that let her put her up, because otherwise it'd take her hours to get out there. The exam started at 8 or 9 in the morning, And the other aspect of that was, again, discriminatory in its outcome, whether it was designed that way or not. You had to apprentice, you had to work with an accounting firm, certified accountant for, however many hours, 200 hours, whatever it was, which again, there are no Black accountants. And if the white firms don't want to hire Black, you're never going to, you're never going to be able to get the certification. So even though it might not have been formally, it didn't say that a Black person couldn't be certified as an accountant, it was a virtually impossible barrier. Now, obviously, she was able to overcome that. She did find someone who would work with her, but these were very real barriers that excluded Blacks for many, many years.
Yeah. And I think I think that if you look at the history of a lot of these occupational associations and their push to licensure, some of them were very overtly about kind of keeping the riffraff out of their occupation, of raising the quality. And you can imagine how they would define that of the folks who were in those occupations. I think the way that this kind of comes in through the back door now is that lots of occupational licenses have moral turpitude clauses. Basically, you have to show that you have a certain set of moral values. And there was some work, I'm not going to remember who it was, but it was basically looking at the range of occupations that were available in different states to people who had been incarcerated. And it turns out a very, very narrow range, because you can't get bonded, you can't show moral turpitude, you can't kind of meet these clauses after having this experience of being incarcerated. And you think about that, and you completely understand why those clauses might be there, but we don't kind of think about how limiting that is for people's choices once they get out of prison. And of course, it pushes them further and further into basically dead-end, low-wage jobs, because those are the ones that don't have licenses in many cases. Yeah.
Okay, so I promised we wouldn't spend the whole time talking about
I
occupation.
know, we keep going back to it. Well, I'm fascinated by occupations. It's a thing.
But let's say I know you did some work on CEO pay. That's one near and dear to my heart. So let's
Yeah.
talk about rents and
Yeah.
CEO.
So there's always been this tension between thinking about the astronomical pay of CEOs as being essentially reflecting their worth, right? That as companies get more and more complicated, they get more and more multinational, there's more and more billions of dollars at stake. The payoff to having that CEO who's just slightly more skilled than the other person is enormous in dollar terms. So therefore we compensate, we look for, we pay our CEOs these astronomically high salaries, basically to be able to leverage that itsy bitsy bit of skill that they may have more than the next person in line. The other argument here is that, well, CEO pay really doesn't have much to do with productivity or marginal returns to the firm or the extra value that they get. And you can certainly identify enormously incompetent CEOs who are earning these absolutely ridiculous salaries. And then the question is, well, how does that happen? And part of the way that sociologists tend to think about this is that the way that CEO compensation is actually set just kind of fosters this leapfrogging, this kind of constant exceeding what the last guy got, in ways that quickly become divorced from any sort of productivity type of metric. So just to give you an example, it's Tom Dupreet and some of his colleagues did this really interesting paper where they were looking at the role of compensation consultants in CEO pay setting, and essentially, say you're looking for a new CEO as for your company, and what you do is you hire one of these compensation consultants, and they do kind of like what real estate agents do is they look around at comparable companies and they say, well, this person is getting paid that and has this package and gets this little frou-frou thing on the side, and you need to do 5% better than that. And whenever you have a compensation consultant and that's how pay is getting set, you're just going to kind of get this leapfrogging, and it becomes kind of a game, just like you might think that sports salaries among the elite professional players, it may not be so much about the absolute value of the dollars that they're getting, but they just want to be paid more than that last guy because they think they're better than that last guy. So this is kind of ratcheting up pay, and this is fundamentally a social process. But then you can also kind of think about the classic foxes in the hen house. When you have a board of directors that's beholden to or by and large appointed by the CEO, and the CEO asks for, a $1 trillion pay package, to pull something randomly out of my hat, Elon Musk, then the board of directors may be inclined to go along with that. And shareholders are typically not paying enough attention, really. I think there was actually a case where shareholders rejected a CEO, a package for Musk, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. Yeah. But that's very, very rare that actually happens. So you get kind of this, this rent extraction. You're basically taking more and more of the firm profits, and you're giving it to a very limited set of people at the very top, because of this social process and the way that we have decided that is okay to set CEO pay. Coupled with the fact, again, that in public companies, shareholders are often just really they're kind of rubber stamping anything that comes their way in terms of a vote. So something there is kind of broken in the governance structure.
Yeah, and if we had, kind of a devotee of, neoclassical economics, the story they would like to tell is that the board of directors is sort of ruthlessly scrutinizing the data. Here we have our CEO. What did they do for our company? What are they doing for other companies? What do the other company CEOs look like? What are they getting paid? What are they producing? And they would say, if they don't think their CEO is measuring up, they'd say, oh, maybe we'll cut your pay by $5 million this year, or maybe we'll get a new CEO and pay them $5 million less. But that seems to almost never happen. I don't have much occasion to talk to board members, but I have a couple times tried to raise that politely. I mean, do you think about paying the CEO less? And, I can't think of how exactly I phrased it. And they looked at me like it's a really strange question. And, as a practical matter, you made the point a moment ago, the board is largely selected through the CEO top management. And as a practical matter, board members are, if they're recommended for approval by the rest of the board, they win. It goes to the vote of the shareholders. They win that vote over 99% of the time.
Yeah.
So if you want to keep your position as a board member, you probably don't want to upset your other board members who all were picked by the CEO or the top management. You probably don't want to upset them by saying things like, this CEO doesn't seem especially great. Why don't we just pay them, 20, 30, 40% less? So you do get, as you're saying, this one way just goes up. There's no downward pressure. And, one of the things a couple of years ago, when they had the UAW strike against the big three, they printed, I forget where I saw this, I'm sure it was printed a number of places, but the salaries of the CEOs of our big three, which were all 20 million. The top was GM's, was like 29 million, if I recall correctly. And then they had the big three in Europe, which were, Daimler-Benz and I think it was BMW. I forget who the three were, but there were three very large companies, as big, profitable as ours. And the same with Nissan and Toyota and what was it, Honda, I think. Anyhow, the European ones were in the high single digit, like 7, 8, 9 million. And the Japanese ones, I think one was a Korean, they were even lower. They were like 6 million. And one of them, I think, was getting something like 2.8 million. I think it was Hyundai, but I won't swear to that. But the point was, it's a huge difference. And you couldn't say that our CEOs, at least were in any obvious way, returned to shareholders producing better than the CEOs of these companies that were getting paid, a quarter as much in the case of the European ones, and a little more than a tenth as much in the case of the Japanese ones. So it's hard to argue that was based on, market outcomes.
Yeah. Well, and there's another set of assumptions in that, the idea is that, well, you're paying them to motivate them to do the best possible job for the company. But I just find it really hard to believe that if I were to be offered a pay package of, say, I'm going to keep this realistic, $2 million a year, I would work any less hard than if I was only offered $1 million a year, right? I mean, it just doesn't it just seems like it's ignoring a lot of the realities of human motivation to work hard. And, we're picking a little bit now on CEOs, but I think this kind of works throughout the labor market, is that there is a tendency to kind of assume that people really only care about money, but we know better, right? People care about things other than just money. It turns out, I just saw a really interesting paper by Nathan Wilmers, who was at MIT, and some colleagues, and they used job reviews from Glassdoor to try to measure how different workplaces, different firms, how the people talked about them in terms of there being a friendly atmosphere. It turns out that workers, you're conditioning on all the usual things that you would condition on with a worker: their age, their experience, their education level, blah blah blah. Workers would actually essentially be willing to trade off a little bit of wages in order to work at a friendlier firm. So we know that people are not just motivated by wages, and I think this becomes relevant in the kind of thinking about the CEO or the millionaire type of context, is that social embeddedness happens, and that people they tend to become very embedded in a particular company or a particular set of networks And yes, you can overcome that inertia, but it takes a lot of effort, and people don't necessarily either want to do that, or they can't do it for family reasons, or they like their house, whatever it might be. It kind of plays into this whole and kind of puts a caveat on this whole idea that, well, as long as we pay these ridiculous salaries, then we'll get the best people, and they will be incentivized to put their absolute highest effort into this. And the corollary there is that there's no other way that we might motivate them. We just simply have to pay them more and more, which I think is a false assumption. But.
Yeah. So we covered a lot of ground, and unfortunately, well, I don't know whether it's unfortunate or not, we spent more time on occupational licensing than at least I intended and I said we would. But in any case, let me just ask, is there some issue on rent that we haven't touched that you're just dying to get across? Because I don't want to keep you here all day.
Oh, dying to get across. I mean, I do think that rent is really, conceptually, I find it a very appealing explanation. But one of the challenges, it's very, very difficult to pinpoint what's rent and what's just payment for skills. And I think because the idea of rents is really predicated on a counterfactual. It's the wages above and beyond what you would get in a perfectly competitive labor market. Well, we don't have one of those, and we've never had one of those. So how do you know? So I think, that's one of the challenges that I've run into in kind of thinking through a lot of these issues is how do you actually put your finger on where the rent begins and where the simple returns to skill end. But I do think that we're starting to get more and more tools to try to understand skills in a way, and I think that we might eventually be able to kind of parse this out.
I guess I put the question a little differently, because I agree with you completely on that, but I guess I put it a little differently. To my view, you'd raised this point before, there's a tendency, certainly by conservatives, but I think a lot of liberals, to think of the market as just something that's out there, and then the government comes in and we regulate it, or we tax it, or do whatever. And to my view, I think that's just a fundamental misconception. There is no market out there. There's always the government that's structuring the market, and we could structure it differently. So to my view, the point is that, we're never going to get to, perfectly competitive, wonderful, and we shouldn't try. I mean, we should think of how we want to best structure the market. And, that doesn't mean no rents, it just means different rents, and
different rents.
Some will be lower.
Yeah. And, from a policy perspective, I think, thinking about the rent approach, when it comes down to pushing different sorts of policies, we talked a little bit about sort of tinkering with occupational licenses and maybe sunsetting some of them. But really, what we might want to think about is, okay, let's do what we can to strengthen the rents of the less fortunate, the less educated workers, basically to allow them to kind of keep up with, and maybe in the process take some of the rents away from those very top end workers. So in the end, you come down to a policy that's, let's strengthen unions, let's strengthen the minimum wage. And I think that you're right, is if we could communicate that markets are never open, they're never free of government intervention, there's absolutely no such thing. We could say, okay, well, how do we set the rules of the game to make it more equitable and to get outcomes that are more optimal for more people? And I think, maybe that's the way forward, as opposed to worrying about, well, how can we get to this mythical unicorn free market, which nobody's ever seen in the history of mankind, right? So,
well, I think that's a great place to end it. So, thanks a lot for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Enjoyed our chat.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.